ago this month, it took Charles Lindbergh 33 and a half hours to fly from New York to Paris in the Spirit of St. Louis. To mark the 40th anniversary of the historic event, and in conjunction with the Paris Air Show, the Spirit of St. Louis will again make the journey to the City of Light. The flying time in a military airlift command C-141 jet will be about 8 hours. But there's a difference this time. The 1967 version of the Spirit of St. Louis will be a replica, faithful in every detail. The original aircraft, under the terms of the bequest of the government, is in the Smithsonian and cannot be moved. Here at Orange County Airport near Los Angeles, the final touches are being applied by the replica's builder, pilot Frank Tallman. Frank Tallman, you're probably best known as a pilot, but you're also president of Tallman Aviation. Tell me, is this one of your biggest projects?
Well, I don't know whether it's one of the biggest, Jerry. It's certainly one of the most interesting, and from a historical standpoint, perhaps one of the most important.
Well, this is quite a feat, really, rebuilding the Spirit of St. Louis. What led you to get involved with the Spirit?
Well, of course, it's the whole project of the United States government this year, the Department of Commerce and the State Department, and the Paris Air Show, which is in its 27th time, and perhaps the world's most important air show. And of course, the Spirit of St. Louis led on aviation transportation as we know it today. So the whole theme of the Paris Air Show this year is wrapped around the Spirit of St. Louis.
I understand that you're going to be playing an important part in the reenactment of this year.
Well, I'll have the pleasure, I think, of flying this into Le Bourget and landing it at Paris, and at least if all indications are correct, there'll be almost as many people meeting at this time as met Lindbergh, so it'll be quite exciting.
Tell me, how long have you been working on the construction here of the replica?
Well, it will have been over 6 months by the time we complete it and flight check it.
And this was your own operation here. I understand you're financing it all yourself. Tell me, how much do you expect it will all cost by the time it's done?
Well, it's a little hard to estimate because we're still just a couple of weeks away from completion, and there's a great deal of last-minute detail to clear up, but if present indications are correct, why it will have cost us over $50,000. An almost inconceivable amount of pieces have to be built to rebuild an exact copy of the Spirit.
Well, let's take the wing, for example. I understand that there are quite a few small and very intricately designed parts that go into the fabrication of the ribs and the other parts for the wing.
Well, of the more than 50 ribs in the wings, each rib is composed of 63 pieces, hand-cut, hand-formed, steamed, glued, and tacked. And there's 3,000 pieces there just alone in the ribs. And I would say if we counted the small brass nails that are put in, there are probably 20,000 individual, somewhere between 20 and 30,000 individual activities involved in just building the wing alone for this airplane.
Well, that sounds like quite a project. Tell me, in order to build a exact replica, keeping faithful to the original design, how are you keeping on schedule? Are you using the original blueprints or what?
Well, of course, we are using blueprints of the aircraft, but of course, as there were in the original airplane, there being only one of them ever built, there we find with the blueprints changes that were made with no attempt made to change the drawings.
But tell me something here about the engine, which we can see here behind us. What kind of an engine is it, and is it the same type of engine that Lindbergh used?
Yes, Jerry, it's a Wright J5, exactly the same as Lindbergh used, within a few serial numbers.
What about the instrumentation that you're going to have in the cockpit? Of course, Colonel Lindbergh didn't have too much in the way of modern conveniences as we now know on our modern aircraft. What will you have in the way of instruments?
Well, we will have identically the same panel that Lindbergh had, with some instruments which have long since disappeared from the ken of anything except history. One is the Pioneer Earth Inductor Compass, which no longer is used. As you know, in the Air Force, you have some very exotic navigational methods now, and of course, his was primarily dead reckoning.
Well, now, after you fly the replica of the Spirit of St. Louis into Le Bourget. I understand it will go on display at this year's Paris Air Show.
Yes, it'll be in the main entrance to the American Pavilion in Paris, and it will be inside the replica of the St. Louis Arch.
Tell me something here about your flying suit. It looks quite period to me.
Yeah, this is a correct suit of the time. As a matter of fact, it's identically the same kind of flying suit by the same manufacturer that Lindbergh wore. It also happens to be the flying suit that General Jimmy Stewart wore in making the Spirit of St. Louis.
What do you plan to do with the aircraft after the close of the Paris Air Show? Will you bring it back with you or leave it in France?
Well, at this moment, Jerry, we don't know. As you know, we have funded this project since the very beginning, and we rather hope and expect that the aircraft will be sponsored. And, of course, when it is, it will be to some extent up to the sponsor to determine where it goes and to whom it goes.
Well, tell me, Frank, as a final question, if you were to make the same flight today in your replica of the Spirit that Lindbergh made back in 1927, what would it be like?
Well, I don't imagine it would be much different than it was in Lindbergh's day, with one exception. That is, if you use the same navigational facilities that are part of this aircraft, you'd have the same navigational problems and the same fatigue. But, of course, thanks to a pretty savvy Air Force Air-Sea Rescue Service and various other facilities, you'd probably be monitored all the way across the Atlantic, and so you'd have a pretty good chance of being picked up if something went wrong, but the flight would have the same hazards that the other one had, apart from being picked up.
Well, I'm sure you'll have a good flight into Paris on May the 21st, and I'm sure the French will turn out in the thousands as they did 40 years ago. Now, it's getting a little noisy here at Orange County Airport. Why don't we go inside and take a look at your wing sections?
Fine, Jerry.